to meeting number 3 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, also known as the AG calls it, the mighty OGO. Before we continue, just a gentle reminder, everyone, keep your headphones away from your microphones at all times so we can protect the hearing of our very valued interpreters. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3c, the committee is holding a briefing session with the Auditor General and her team on 3 reports she tabled in June 2025, the jet fighter capacity, use of federal office space, and contracts with GC Strategies. We now welcome back to OGO. AG Hogan, the floor is yours. Traditionally, we do 5 minutes, but because there's 3 reports, feel free to go past the 5 minutes if you need them. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try and be succinct anyways. Thank you.
Time.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss some of our recent reports that were tabled in Parliament on June 10th. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. With me today are Andrew Hayes, Deputy Auditor General, and Nicholas Swales, Marguerite Artmutlu, and Sami Hanush, the principals who were responsible for the 3 audits. First, our audit of Canada's future fighter jet capability examined the large multi-year project aimed at maintaining a strong fighter jet capability to protect the safety and security of Canadians. We found several risks that could jeopardize the timely introduction of the new CF-35 jets. Estimated costs for the Future Fighter Capability Project reached $27.7 billion in 2024, which is almost 50% more than National Defense's original $19 billion estimate, a figure that was based on outdated information. In addition, estimates did not include key elements like infrastructure upgrades and advanced weapons, which would add at least $5.5 billion to the total estimate. D'autres risques importants comprennent
Other significant risks include the possibility of a shortage of qualified CF-35 pilots and a delay of more than 3 years in the construction of 2 new fighter squadron facilities. Additional costs will therefore have to be incurred to build temporary facilities. Active and ongoing risk and cost management is essential to ensure that the CF-35 fleet enters service on schedule. Let us now turn to our audit of federal office space. As part of this audit, we examined the government's efforts to downsize its office space portfolio to reduce costs and reallocate underutilized space that could be converted into affordable housing. In 2017, Public Services and Procurement Canada estimated that half of federal office space was underutilized. We found that the department had made little progress in its multi-year effort to reduce office space by 50% by 2034. Notably, efforts between 2019 and 2024 resulted in a reduction of less than 2%, mainly due to a lack of funding. The department estimates that reducing federal office space will result in savings of approximately $3.9 billion over the next 10 years.
The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC, supported by Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada, is tasked with converting surplus federal office properties into affordable housing through the Federal Lands Initiative. The audit found that CMHC is on track to meet the initiative's 2027-28 target of securing commitments to build 4,000 new housing units. However, the target is based only on commitments, and only 49% will be ready for occupancy by 2027-28. Public Services and Procurement Canada and federal tenants must accelerate efforts to help increase stock for housing that is sustainable, accessible, and affordable. Our last audit examined 106 contracts awarded to GC Strategies Incorporated by 31 federal organizations from April 2015 to March 2024. We found these organizations frequently disregarded government procurement rules meant to ensure fairness, transparency, and value for Canadians. Dans 21% des contrats que nous avons...
In 21% of the contracts we reviewed, organizations did not have documentation showing that they had confirmed the security clearances of the individuals performing the work. We also found that organizations often did not monitor the work performed by contract workers. Organizations did not have documentation showing what work had been performed, who had performed it, or whether these individuals had the required experience and qualifications to carry out the work. Our findings echo those of previous audits, which also identified shortcomings in how public servants apply federal procurement rules. Our report does not contain any recommendations because I do not believe the federal government needs more rules. Rather, the existing rules need to be understood and followed. Mr. Chair, that concludes my opening statement. We would be happy to answer any questions from committee members. Thank you.
Thank you, Hogan. We'll start with Mrs. Block for 6, please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan. Welcome here, and welcome to your staff who have joined you in helping us understand the reports that you've tabled. We're talking about fighter jets, we're talking about service contracts, and we're talking about federal office space. So there's a wide range of topics that we're covering today. So getting right to it. In your report number 3, Current and Future Use of Federal Office Space, it says that the Treasury Board plays, and I'm going to quote, a key role in providing cooperation across government. What, if any, rationale was given for why the Centre of Expertise for Real Property, which was created in 2021, was dissolved only 3 years later?
The Treasury Board Secretariat actually plays many roles when it comes to federal office space. As the employer, they do set the tone for in-office presence. So that is a key element to understand when you look at how federal office space is being used and how much is needed. But when it comes to the Center of Expertise, that was put in place to look at a horizontal review of all the fixed assets of the government. They issued 119 recommendations, and we did find that they were dissolved in March of 2024. We were told that it was because of a lack of funding, and that now the responsibility rested with the organizations who had received the recommendations in order to ensure that they had been implemented. But we found that only 21 of the 119 had been implemented by the time the center was dissolved. So I am concerned that some of those recommendations may get forgotten, but it really now rests with all of the departments who received them to act on them.
Thank you. According to your report, with this dissolution, the government-wide oversight for implementing recommendations to insist in the government's conversion of the Federal Lands Initiative disappeared, leaving 82% of recommendations not implemented, as you've just pointed out. Based on your report, had the government kept in place its oversight, do you believe there would be more progress in their efforts to create affordable housing?
I'm not sure that that one element of oversight would have been the thing that would have kept this on track or increased the pace of it. I think we found in the report that the larger departments who occupy a lot of federal space had not yet signed on for space reduction agreements. They cited to us lack of clarity around the return to office mandate. Would there be an increased presence needed or not? the space needed to deliver on their mandate. So there's many elements. While oversight is always a good mechanism to have to ensure that people stay focused on recommendations and the end game, I don't think I would say it's the only reason that there's been lack of progress.
So based on your audit, how much would it have cost to keep the oversight program running? I know they were given, I believe it was $5 million in 2021. How much would it have cost to keep the oversight program running compared to how much it has cost by the delays since its dissolution?
I'm not sure I could give you a number. The funding that was received was funding done over 3 years, and it was meant to do the heavy legwork of doing the whole fixed asset review and then coming up with the recommendation. So it would stand to reason that you would need less people to consider to continue on oversight. But that would be a question better asked, I think, to the Treasury Board as what they would have thought would have been needed to maintain a more consistent level of oversight.
Did the government provide any rationale for why they did not implement the recommendations on their own?
No, I don't think there was one reason. There's 119 of them, and it stands to reason that some of them have long lead times when you're looking at disposing of underutilized buildings. It's not like there was a building that was sitting vacant. So it meant you had to figure out which was the best building to be in, consolidate departments and agencies into a building. That meant you had to retrofit or renovate those buildings. So some of these recommendations have very long tails. And so I'm not sure that there'd be one reason to say why oversight is no longer there.
Okay. According to CMHC, the Federal Lands Initiative gives discounts on the government property purchase based on the level of social outcomes. Did your audit reveal what kinds of discounts federal land is being sold at? And if so, what was it?
So we didn't look at what the property was sold at. That wasn't really the focus. Our focus was more on, are the properties being freed up in locations that are with the greatest needs for housing? And what we found is that that wasn't always the case. Buildings were being freed up in places where there wasn't the greatest need in a community. So that really comes down to Public Service and Procurement Canada having the information to know which are the buildings they want to target, and then how do you move federal tenants out of it. And I think our biggest concern was around affordability of the end game, of the outcomes. And what we found is that the homes being built were really not affordable enough for those most in need.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Mr. Gasparo, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It's greatly appreciated. Varying wide breadth of reports in front of us for sure. I'm going to focus on the fighter jets, if you don't mind. In one of the reports I read, you mentioned the need for training personnel. I think pilots were obviously one of them, but personnel more broadly. Now that the government has committed to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2030. Any thoughts on how best to deploy that increase in capital to meet the objectives that you laid out around personnel? That's sort of part one of the question. And part two is, are there any best practices from some of our partners within the programming, or within the program, in terms of what they're doing to deploy capital and be to meet the operational objectives and be as cost-effective as possible? Sorry for the two-part question. I guess I could have broken it up.
That's okay. I wrote them down. That's a big question, and I'm not sure that we tackled all of that in the fighter jets report. We did look at whether or not there was enough trained pilots, because it was a concern that my office had found in 2018 when we did work on the CF-18s, that there was a shortage of trained pilots. The finding here, while very similar, highlights that the training program anticipates they won't have enough qualified pilots. And it's a little different here because you're going to need pilots who can fly both types of aircraft, and then you need to upskill. I know that National Defense is looking at how to adjust that plan, and they're going to need to. When it comes to my thoughts on where to invest and not invest and best practices on training, I mean, I'm not the one to tell the government where to spend its money. I'm the one who comes in and says, you made that decision, and how did you do in spending it? But what I can tell you, in October, we will be releasing a report on training or recruitment of new members to the Canadian Armed Forces, and that'll speak to some of the concerns that we found there. I think there is no shortage of places where National Defense can invest this funding, and it's about finding the right place, but making sure that you always have the personnel to support that sort of investment. And here you need not only trained pilots, but technicians to maintain the planes and individuals to work in the bases. So there's no shortage of places for D&D to invest in.
For sure. I think where I was going with the best practices pieces, there are some examples, obviously, of our defense partners on this project, obviously, who have already, deployed capital, deployed resources, have bodies in place, and there might be some best practices there, right?
I think what I would add to that is Canada is part of the Joint Strike Fighter Program Office, and in that office they benefit from what other countries are doing, and that office does set sort of minimum standards for the facilities and training expectations, and so Canada is benefiting from the best practices of its allies in that program already, but they need to stay focused on it. And one of our findings was really about costing, and how that program had issued updated costing, yet Canada hadn't been using it in its estimates. So not losing sight that there is some intel there that they could use, I think would be a good step forward.
For sure. How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
You've got 2 minutes.
Okay. I don't know if you're going to have the full time, and maybe on the way back, Mr. Chair, you can follow up. This is more around, not to completely geek out for the 8 people who are watching on TV. I hate to put you to sleep, so I apologize in advance. I'm concerned, not concerned. I have questions on what type of methodologies and research you used when coming up with this specific report. What information and data do your office and team researchers rely on? Because I'm sure it can't be necessarily easy where you're not necessarily fully dealing with open source information. So I'm just curious.
So we have access to a broad range of information, at times protected, that then we can't talk about. So if you, I always love talking about audit, so if you really want to geek out on audit, I would encourage you to go to the back of our audit reports where we have an About the Audit section, and it does list for you our audit criteria. We follow Canadian auditing standards, which means that we have to gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. What that might look like will depend on the topic that we're auditing, but the expectations that we hold the department to are listed in the back. They're agreed to with the department, and then we look to their information, what databases they may have, what contracts they may have, and we will go to other countries to look for examples and other sources. We always try to have criteria that are outside of the federal government to be able to identify gaps and talk about best practices when we can. It's a little more complicated in the defense space, given a lot of it is protected, but rest assured that we've seen the information that we need to see, and it's rigorous enough that you can follow up, you can rely on it.
I might just add, we do get access to Treasury Board and Cabinet documents, so we see the internal analyses that are performed for the purposes of decision makers having the best information possible to make decisions. So it is much more than open source. We get pretty much broad access to almost everything. There are very, very small limitations to the information that we can see. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Ms. Goodrow, please, for 6.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to start by thanking you for giving us time today. It's really very precious information you're bringing to us here at the committee. I am new to this committee. I'm newly present here, but I really look forward to your next report on recruitment and training. Reading the reports now, I must say that there is something that struck me. So it looks like there's a good deal of improvisation. Why is it that Public Services and Procurement Canada and National Defence seem to be lacking essential data? That seems quite surprising to me, and it's even discouraging. How can we even know? I mean, we don't even know how many civil servants, are in federal offices to whom we must provide an office. So how do we come up with the figures that we have here in your reports? How do you get these figures? I'd like to hear you on this. Indeed, one of our findings was about the lack of data needed to make well-informed decisions. Sometimes there is data, but it's not coherent, it's not necessarily gathered on a single basis. In fact, we found that each department was left to its own to find a way to verify whether civil servants used offices, came to offices, and we evaluated the various types of methods that were used for this. In our recommendations, we encouraged a uniform method, that everyone use a single method for all civil servants. Once you've got that sort of data, once you have some idea of how many civil servants you're talking about, you need to know how many of them are using office space, and then you can make a better decision about what sort of space to give up. So these are basic data that are lacking. There is progress made, but we need a more coherent approach across government. And I would like to know, Mr. Chair, from the Auditor General, what's going on with the housing stock. From 2026, basically, they went from 6 million square meters to 5.9 million square meters since 2019. So, good heavens, how could so little have been accomplished in such a long time? We asked that question because the government in 2017 had specified that federal office space was underutilized and that they wished to reduce it by 50% by 2034. That was their goal. But in 2019 and 2024, no specific funding was set aside for this project. In 2024, PSPC did give, or the government gave PSPC funding to accomplish this goal. So one would hope for better progress based on targets. But without targets and people carrying out this work, there will be little progress, as we've seen so far. I have little time. In the report, if we're unable to know how many civil servants are actually using office space, if we can't learn this from PSPC, it's difficult, of course, for them to manage a portfolio. And, of course, we have this extreme need for housing. I can see a link here between these two issues. Perhaps it's a government culture, and we'll need to bring in rules to ensure that people do what they say they're going to do, especially when it has to do with the government announcing commitments. Now, let's move to the F-35 project. In 2011, I was a political attaché, and I can tell you that this was important on the ground. People wanted to hear about it 4 years later after Harper, Trudeau, Carney now, and there have been a number of people in charge of national defense. But you've told us that Bagotville and Cold Lake bases are 3 years behind in their infrastructure projects that would be needed just to park the fighter jets, and that cost billions. So how worrisome is this? Because to my mind, this is quite unfortunate. We need to keep in mind that national defense did take a step in the right direction. Before they decided which fighter jets they would use to replace the CF-18s, that they had to improve the infrastructure, the buildings at Baggetville and the other base, but they didn't know all the details. Once the CF-35 was chosen, they got a lot more information to base their plans on, all the needs that they had to plan for, and that's when things slowed down. That said, there are mitigation measures that have been used. There are temporary infrastructure that has been built, but this makes everything cost more. I think we need better planning and risk management. We find that the risk management is somewhat reactive instead of proactive, and I think that's one good example of that. They tried to foresee their needs, but their risk management was reactive, such that they now need these temporary installments and buildings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. When it comes to the staffing and training, there's only 14 positions that have been filled of the 47 as of 2024. Why is that?
I think I might ask Nick to add some details on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, the point we're making is that implementation has been slow. Part of it is that some of the plans, have not fully laid out, and they haven't been, they haven't been advancing at the pace that the plan originally envisaged. So that's the main issue in those particular spheres where there were supposed to be a number of positions already filled.
Okay. If it's not been fully implemented, I guess why not? I know in the report you talk about a lack of information back in 2022, but is like what did you find when you audited this that would have prevented them from getting there, right? I mean, the F-35 has been around for more than 20 years anyway, right? I mean, how did they not have complete information, and why is a lack of information part of what we're seeing as their reason for not being advanced far enough?
I'll see if Nick does want to add. I think your question is bringing in a bunch of our findings. There was information that they didn't use, so they used outdated information, which is part of the reason why they're a little late. But what we found is there were a lot of plans that were incomplete and slow progress on it. So I hope that our audit in October on recruitment might shed some light on progress and weaknesses in recruiting. But having positions to plan and do logistics and security is some of the areas that they need to recruit for. So I think there's a lot going on here to figure out why they've been making slow progress. I don't know if you wanted to add at all, Nick.
I just want to jump in right there because in your report you say there's 246 permanent positions required. In the report, there's 10 bases that are on the map. Now, I know most of the report is based off of Baggetville and Cold Lake. It seems to me like 246 permanent staff for those 10 bases would be a massive understaffing of what would be required for the F-35 program. I'm not an expert, but the 246, is that just for the first 2 bases, or is that for all 10 bases, or like what is that for?
Mr. Chair, perhaps I can help to explain that. One of the observations we make is that the process of implementing the F-35 transition is in its early stages, and the plans haven't been fully drafted. So this was one area where there was a plan that had laid out how many positions they actually needed in specific areas. So we specify it's mission planning, some types of logistics and security. So that is not the entire need for the F-35 on all those bases. That was simply those areas where they had actually identified a number by a certain time period, and only a small number of those had so far been filled. For the rest, there wasn't that level of detail in the plans yet.
So why is that level of detail not in the plans yet, right? I mean, I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here, is this has been ongoing for years, and yet we still have an incomplete plan. Why is that, and who's responsible for this? Like which do you have a name for who's hasn't completed the planning for this? I mean, this is kind of crazy that we don't have a complete plan yet.
So, Mr. Chair, I think I would send the member to Exhibit 2.2. We outlined sort of the 5 phases of transitioning from the CF-18s to the CF-35s, and they're still in phase 1, right? Build-up phase is coming. So this is National Defense's plan. Ultimately, who is responsible? Well, there's the Chief of Defense Staff and the Deputy Minister. Ultimately, making sure that Canada's fighter jet capability is available and can transition is their ultimate responsibility. And I think that's the question should go to National Defense on progress, the gaps in their plans, and how they plan on updating those. We did give them a recommendation about making sure that their master plan was much more comprehensive.
Thank you, Mr. Patzer. Ms. Rochefort, please, for 5 minutes.
Oui, bonjour, Madame Hogan. Is it for
Yes,
5
hello, Ms. Hogan.
5 seconds? Okay, thank you. Thank you for highlighting the fact that Public Service Procurement Canada was provided funding in 2024-2025. And so basically, if I understand correctly from your report, there's the first tranche of 37 tenants representing 90% of the office space that were asked to begin reducing their office space in June 2024, so just about a year. Of those, you said that 15 of them had not yet signed an office space reduction agreement, and negotiations were still ongoing at the time of the audit. Is that normal? How would you characterize the fact that not all of the 37 tenants representing such a major size component of the office space had not yet signed an agreement? And could you share the names of who those tenants are?
So I don't know the names of all 15. We would have to look into our files and see if we could get back to the committee. But I do believe that you could ask Public Service and Procurement Canada. That is the best way to get the most accurate information. Ours was at a point in time when we did the audit, which was several months ago, and I would hope that there would be progress. So my advice would be to get that from them. Why are there only 15 out of the 30 or 15 out of the 37 had not yet signed agreements? We heard a few things. One, it was, as I mentioned earlier, was about the uncertainty on the return to office mandate, whether they would need more space than what they anticipated they could occupy. Some said that the space was needed to properly deliver on their mandate. Another would be perhaps the lack of a financial incentive. Many federal organizations do not pay rent, right? We occupy space that Public Service and Procurement Canada has. For example, my office doesn't pay rent. So then it becomes the will of the Deputy Minister to put up their hand. I have offered to reduce the space in Ottawa by almost 50%, even though I don't have a financial incentive. So I think that might be part of the reason as well, that certain departments are not putting this on their priority list.
Some uncertainty, would that be correct?
Uncertainty, and really there are so many things to focus efforts on. This isn't something that's costing you something, but it is costing the bigger, broader federal government, and I think every department should look at how they can contribute to meeting this goal.
You mentioned, I think, in your report, resistance to change. Was that equally a significant factor?
I think they were all of varying degrees. It depends on the departments. So for example, some might have had dedicated individual office spaces for each employee. So the resistance to change there will be much greater if you're already in an environment where you're hoteling, where you just reserve a spot and sit, right? So it's a big transition for so many public servants as well. So there's many factors that play into why progress is slow.
You also, as part of your audit, you did a survey yourself, correct? I believe, and not all tenants responded. Is that a surprise? Do normally with this form of survey, do they?
I have to admit, I was impressed with the response rate. Getting over 80% response rate on a survey is considered extraordinary and actually really good results. So, you know, those were their thoughts and views, and that's why we felt confident enough to put them in our audit report. It wasn't like a handful had reported, the majority really had given us their views.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ms. Gaudreau for 2.5 minutes, please.
2 minutes 30. Je vais y aller avec
2 minutes and a half. I will put my questions quickly and efficiently. Through you, Mr. Chair, Ms. Auditor General, again regarding your reports, when you mentioned that Public Services and Procurement Canada did not make public the information that you think necessary that it render public, I have some concern if indeed there was information that you didn't receive, that this would become an ongoing problem, that we slowly become less and less transparent merely to be able to move faster, to deal with the current economic situation of the country, and you know, we just start tolerating lack of transparency across the board. Is this a trend that you see from your position looking at the government, or is this just something that we feel? That's quite a question. I think that very often departments are a little reticent, don't rush to make information public unless it's been reviewed by their minister in order, you know, not to get any blowback. So what we say here about current and future use of office space, we found information about best practices elsewhere. We mentioned Australia that makes public information, and to my mind, doing so would incite deputy ministers to free up their spaces. And that's why we made mention of Australia's practice. But more broadly speaking, I do think sometimes information should be made public, and that's why we mention that in our reports. We want to ensure that discussion is vigorous and that all information is available so people can make appropriate decisions. And to end, I certainly want to say that being reactive rather than proactive is a very bad thing. I myself was a businesswoman, and if I approach things that way, I can tell you that businesses wouldn't survive. I think that risk management should be flexible and use both approaches, but I would expect more mitigation measures of a proactive nature and only reactive when necessary, rather than the inverse.
Please, for 5.
So much for coming. Thank you for the reports you've done. And I'm hoping to kind of focus on the current and future use of office space. And I'm trying to better understand kind of how the affordable housing programs work, because when I talk to families in my constituency, they don't really care about the big announcements in Ottawa. They care about whether they can actually pay the rent and get an affordable roof over their head. So now I noticed in the report that Ottawa uses the term affordable housing to mean 80% of today's sky-high market rent. And StatsCan says it should be no more than 30% of a family's income. And those two very radically different definitions seem to me to be a bit of the problem. Would you agree that this difference in definition is a big part of the problem, and exactly why the lowest income families, the ones we need to help the most, are still being left out in the cold?
So the concern around the measure used for affordable housing is not the first time that I've raised this concern. I did an audit on chronic homelessness and identified, as you say, Statistics Canada bases affordable housing on rent, but so does the National Housing Strategy. So Canada's National Housing Strategy says that is the benchmark, right? Pre-tax household income. You shouldn't spend more than 30% of it on your housing needs. but the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation that delivers many of these programs uses a different one. They do base it in this program and in a few others on 80% of median market rent. And in a time when rent is increasing because of the shortage of housing, it ends up with rental properties that are not meeting the needs of those who need it the most. In this case, there was that definition, but also the fact that the buildings that were being released to be used in the Canada Lands Initiative were not in cities with the greatest needs. So there was two things at play here that we think could increase access to affordable housing.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, does it make sense to you that the new $13 billion Build Canada Homes program is using the exact same flawed affordability definition as was used in the Federal Lands Act? If the smaller program failed to deliver real affordability, why should Canadians expect that this much bigger program won't just fail on a much bigger scale?
So I can't really talk about that program, but what I would expect a housing program to look at would be to think about affordability, to think about accessibility, but then sustainability. And there's a trade-off between them. So not every home can meet all of those criteria. But I would also like to see homes built along the spectrum of houses, not just being rental properties. There are other types of housing along the housing spectrum that I would expect a housing program to consider, and again, the cost benefit of where you invest in a given year.
So I thought that maybe if we can kind of just talk about Canadians who are currently struggling to make ends meet. So, for instance, the store manager at a grocery chain, maybe they're earning about $50,000 a year, and under Ottawa's definition, their affordable rent in Vancouver could still be $2,500 a month. So that's over half of their income, their paycheck. So how would a single mom working full-time make that work?
So I mean, while I love math, I'm not the one who can help someone manage their day-to-day budget. I think it's important to note that the National Housing Strategy does call for affordability to be based on household income, and that Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation is using a different definition. In both of the reports I mentioned, the chronic homelessness one and this, we have given a recommendation to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation to relook at that. And I would expect that they would align with what's in the National Housing Strategy at some point.
So when government calls these units affordable, isn't it true that mostly the vulnerable families in our communities, single parents, one-income families, still won't be able to afford them?
Well, I guess I would state that they are more affordable in that they're less than market rent, but they aren't meeting those with the greatest needs. And that is something a government should be concerned about, is going to get those furthest behind and moving them forward first. And that's why I would expect that some of the houses would be based on income threshold when you determine affordability.
Okay, so I actually had one more kind of like example, because I want Canadians to understand what this really means. Okay, so you have a single income family, like a dad working as a long-term care worker, also $50,000 a year, paying $2,500 in rent, and that basically leaves him $1,700 to cover gas, groceries, heat, clothes for the kids. The rent that they're paying is not actually affordable. Would you agree?
Very brief answer if you're able to.
Again, I would point to Statistics Canada and the National Housing Strategy's definition that affordability when it comes to housing should be based on your pre-tax income and considering all the other things that a household has to spend.
Thanks very much. We're going to go to Mr. Gahir, please. Go ahead for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the AG for appearing before committee. Ma'am, you talked about challenges regarding the CF35 program, including a lack of integrated planning, coordination, insufficient infrastructure readiness, and gaps in workforce and training. We know that having a modern, agile, and effective fighter jet fleet is key to Canada's defense of our airspace, of North American airspace. As we make this strategic investment away from the existing CF-18 fighter jets to a new fleet, I think my question is, what factors must be taken into account to reduce operational capability gaps and reliance on our partners?
I'm going to see if Nick will want to jump in on that. I mean, that's a bigger, broader question about having the military ready, and this audit was really focused in on the transition between the CF-18s and the CF-35s. And I think we identified the need to make sure that estimates and costing use the most up-to-date information, but that you recognize that those need to be evergreen. Things keep going. There are many of the cost increases here. Some were within control of the Department of National Defense, and some are outside control of the Department of National Defense, such as inflation and the global demand for munitions and foreign exchange. So those all have to be factored in when a decision is made up front. But it's not just about having equipment and infrastructure, it's making sure that you have the personnel to man them. We can have all 88 CF-35s, but we need trained pilots and we need trained technicians to maintain them so that in the long term, you can have a strong fighter jet capability for the country. So, National Defense has a lot of balls to manage, and I think your question is best asked to them on how they plan to do that going forward.
Could you talk about the controls, the costing controls that are within the department's control? You said some are outside their control, some are within their control. What's within their control?
Yeah, absolutely. So here, when they originally announced that Canada was moving to CF-35s, the estimate was that the project would cost $19 billion. In my view, what is in control of the department is that information was based on outdated information. There was already up-to-date cost estimates for what a fighter jet would cost, and so that hadn't been factored in. But then they also didn't include in that project all of the elements needed in order to make sure that the planes could reach their full operational capability, meaning they could be used as intended. So some of the things that were missing was power grid upgrades and some of the infrastructure that was essential, and also some of the advanced weaponry. You needed to have missiles on those fighter jets if you wanted to use them as intended, and they weren't there, which is why we say while the cost estimates now are at $27.7 billion, there's at least another $5.5 billion that should be added to that in order to look at the cost of fully transitioning from CF-18s to CF-35s.
So I haven't looked at the contracts, obviously, but when these contracts are negotiated, is it, I'm assuming obviously from what you're saying, it's not a fixed price of, you want to buy one jet, this is the cost that it's going to be. I'm sure there's layers to it. Is that usual practice for how these contracts are negotiated, or?
Well, in this case, it isn't a contract. There's a memorandum of understanding with the United States. This is a nation-to-nation agreement. Canada is part of a group of allies who are purchasing CF-35s. And so Canada's memorandum of understanding calls for 88 planes to be delivered to Canada. That's why Canada is part of the Joint Strike Fighter Program Office, so that they can keep on top of the costs, the latest upgrades that are needed in buildings and so on. So this is unique. It's not like entering into a contract to buy 88 cars. This is about having fighter planes that are compatible with our allies.
So I think, so it's obviously very dynamic in that sense, but how should the Royal Canadian Air Force then balance the operational needs and requirements that they have with the budget and options that are available?
I think this is where we called for better transparency around the full costs of the project and more regular updates, and those were some of the recommendations that we put in our report.
So we know that it's also very important that Canada have fully operational main operating bases where the fighter jets can be stationed. They can conduct day-to-day operations and training. Can you tell us anything about the upgrades or changes that will need to be made to existing operating bases as Canada procures the new fighter jets? You've talked about it very briefly, but just...
Sorry, we're past our time, but if you're able to offer a brief... Oh, no, if you can offer a brief answer.
Yeah, I can offer a really brief answer. What we've put in here about power upgrades and making sure that the facilities are available is the extent to which we can talk about. The rest of that is information that we can't put in the public domain.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Gahir. We'll now go to Mr. Gill. Go ahead for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for joining us, folks. I'm going to talk about GC strategies a bit. You said in 21% of the contracts examined, you found the federal organizations lacked documentation on file that showed valid security clearances for contract resources. The question I have is, did you find any evidence of citizens' personal or health information being compromised or the possibility of that to occur?
Well, our finding is really one flagging the risk that it could occur, right? When you don't have the right security clearances on file and you haven't checked that, there is a risk that personal information, government information, or government assets could be exposed when they shouldn't be. We, however, did look at some of the contracts. We didn't look at all of them in detail and didn't find any breaches. And not having the information on file doesn't mean that the person didn't have a security clearance. It's that it wasn't there. We also looked at this in ArriveCAN and didn't find breaches, but this is a risk. If you determined that a contractor should have security clearance, they should not be doing the work until they have that security clearance.
True. The next question I have, ma'am, is Canadians expect the federal organizations to have controls, processes, and policies in place to support fair, open, and transparent procurements and to promote value for money. So, as regular Canadians are asking, are we getting value for our money?
So I'm always asked that question, and at times that's a very easy answer to give, and other times it's a more complex answer to give. I think when we're looking at the contracts with GC Strategies, at times this was to provide advice or a report, and we saw those reports. But other times there was no evidence as to what work was done. When we spoke with public servants, they told us that there had been a lot of work, and they assured us that they had received value for money. But what was missing was the ability to demonstrate that to us. And that's why we've called on really going back to basics here. It's not about creating more rules. It's about understanding the rules that are there and knowing why they should be implemented and then implementing them. But this is sort of basic to make sure that the government received what they contracted for before you authorize payment. And often we saw that wasn't happening.
So based on that, if the work was not completed and the payment was still made, has any department or agency tried to recover the money that was paid to GC Strategies for work not having been completed and yet the payment was made?
So, this is I'm often asked this question as well, and the difficulty there is that one of the final steps that a public servant should do is that they certify before they say go ahead and make the payment that the goods or services were received. And we saw that consistently, that public servants were certifying that. What we were looking for was proof. So, for example, 94% of the contracts we looked at required timesheets in order to demonstrate that a contractor had done work. And we found that those were very rarely there. In almost 60% of the cases, there was little to no evidence about that. In fact, in one contract, there was only one contractor that had a timesheet out of 25. So that doesn't mean the work wasn't done. It means that there's no ability to demonstrate to Canadians that you received value for money. And that's a big gap, a big hole that should be there. So it's not as easy as saying, because you didn't have a timesheet, nothing was done, you should go recover it. It's about knowing whether or not the work was done.
You note that you're not making any recommendations with this report, as you already made them before, and you reconfirmed that the policy should be well understood by now by these various agencies. I'm sensing a degree of exasperation on your part, because you go on to say that the procurement policies in place as of 2024 promote fairness, transparency, and value for Canadians when these policies are followed. So what is the percentage of compliance to federal policies across the various departments and agencies? And secondly, who is the most compliant and perhaps who's the least compliant, if you can
perhaps?
I'm not sure I could give you that answer. I would have to point you to a few reports that we did. We did a report on professional services contracts that looked at work awarded to McKinsey. There was this work on contracts awarded to GC Strategies. This report had 31 federal entities in it. The other one had 20. And in almost every case, there was something that was missing. And this included federal, crown corporations, departments, and agencies. And that's why I think there is a need to take a step back and say, why is this happening? Is that there are too many procurement rules, so individuals just don't know them all, and it's impossible to apply them all? Or is it that they're working around them? And I think that that's what the government has to find out, which is why I didn't want to contribute to more rules. I think you have to go back to the basics.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sousa, welcome back to OGO.
It's a pleasure, Chair.
Like
A pleasure, a
week
pleasure.
without appearing here. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Auditor General, for your report. And believe us, we value the contributions you make in regards to all of these reviews and recommendations and highlighting some of the issues that we always need to be apprised of. Let's start with GC Strategies. I know that PSPC had already implemented a host of changes. Much of what you have done, the Ombudsman's done over the course of the last 2 years. Improving the guidance of other government departments, putting caps on task-based contracts, mandatory value for money assessments for all RFPs with time-based basis for payment, mandatory reporting by client departments for the usage of mandatory methods of supply, and ADM level approval for non-competitive contracts, extensions, and single bid procurements. Auditor General, does that demonstrate to you that the federal contract for other federal contractors to be mindful of the rules? And like you've made clear, you don't need any more rules. We just need to abide by them. Are you finding that the recent, like this happened during the pandemic period, what's happening now relative to some of these issues?
So I'm going to talk about two reports, the one on GC Strategies and then the ones on professional services with McKinsey. Both of those reports went back in time. So in this case, we looked at contracts from 2015 to 2024. So prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic, if we're in a post-pandemic time. So this is pervasive, and that's why, to me, it isn't just about what happened since you've changed the rules. All of the rules that were changed following some of my work. So this is forward-looking. All I can tell you is in the past, there was a rather pervasive lack of respect for rules, which is why going back to training and reinforcing what they are is the first step, not creating more.
So to be clear, your recommendations, the Ombudsman recommendations, some of the other reports, investigations that were provided have been adopted by government. We have taken, if I understand correctly, all of these things into action, recognizing some of the things that may have been amiss previously. And was there any interference or engagement by elected officials in any of these contracts?
So I would tell you there was engagement on one contract, I do recall, with an elected official, but that was required by procurement rules because of the dollar value of the contract. Other than that, this is work done by the public service that we are looking at. I would like to think that the returning to the basics and re-educating will help procurement going forward. But I do think that there are a lot of rules, and there is a need to decide whether or not streamlining them will bring better efficiency and better value for money.
And certainly during the time of the pandemic, there was an acceleration of trying to get things done very quickly under the urgency of the time. On another matter with the F-35s, are you called before PACP now to do another witness before this very issue? You're here today. Are you doing more committees?
Well, this afternoon I'm going to the Public Accounts Committee, but that's an in-camera discussion about my office and how we can support committee members. But anytime I'm invited, I'm more than happy to go to committee. Typically, the National Defense Committee would study this, the Senate committees. I would trust that the Public Accounts Committee will have outlined what they're expecting to study, but perhaps after they chat with me this afternoon.
Would it be appropriate given the recommendations and the work and the reports you've made, it's now been given to government for their review. And are they reviewing? Is there, I believe there is a review underway right now by government to respond to some of the work you've done. Is that correct?
I believe that the Prime Minister had asked for a review of the decision to purchase CF-35s. That has not yet been made public. But other than that, the departments have responded to our recommendations. They've agreed with them. It is now really up to the Public Accounts Committee and other committees to hold them to account for delivering on the action plans they intend to do.
Would it be appropriate to have those action plans before us in response? So, I mean, you're going to go before these committees, you're going to talk about the issues that you've already reported. But the main question by all of us is, well, what's going to happen next? And that's the report that we're waiting for.
The Public Accounts Committee does require that every department that is in a report must submit a detailed action plan to them. So I would imagine that committee to committee you could get a hold of that, or you could ask National Defence for their action plan and use it as part of your study on these reports.
Good. Do I have time? I do not.
Plenty of time after, though.
Okay.
Ms. Gaudreau, please.
Very well. I will stick to this topic, national defense. The government is saying everywhere, this is what we have been hearing for weeks now, that they are about to spend a good deal on defense. We'll see how much, when it happens. On the 25th of January, the Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, mentioned that the government would increase defense spending by 5% of GDP. This is wonderful, but now we're hearing that we lack pilots, we lack technicians, that national defense is currently incapable of spending its money. Are we on the right track? Can we have confidence in this potential for 5% more of GDP to be spent by national defense? Difficult for me to answer that question because I'm not aware or privy to all the plans being made to spend the money that's been committed. I understand that some of it has been set aside to increase the salaries of members of CAF, that this will help with recruitment and retention of members. But beyond that, I can't really say anything about whether we're on the right track or not as a country. I would have to see what public service is up to. So I'm thinking of accountability and transparency, having worked in an area where these were important values. How is it that the government is unaware or unable to say that it's aware of what it needs to do to render itself accountable when very small organizations with even not-for-profits, before they get a contract, before they get any funding, undergo reviews and audits and don't even have internal expertise to carry out this work. So how is it that the government itself, given what we've seen with GC strategies, I mean, this is 106 contracts at issue here for which the security clearance was not kept track of, where rules were not followed, where accountability, okay, so the situation was urgent, the times were, but we seem to have clear rules, and I would hope that most departments could respect them and that you have all the information, among other things, to carry out your work appropriately. I think you've brought up the very reason for which I did not put out recommendations in the report on GC strategies. There are already a lot of rules to apply in procurement. The time has come to stand back, ensure that we don't have too many rules, that those that are there are necessary, and that indeed they are applied.
Thank you, Chair. I want to circle back to some of the questions that my colleague was asking in regards to CMHC. According to your report, you found that CMHC was reporting numbers under the federal land initiative that were already committed to being built under another agreement as their own. Is it possible that outside the scope of your audit, there are other instances of numbers being reported like this?
So you're right. In this report, we highlighted what I would say is a lack of clarity in the reporting. It is still other projects that CMHC is leading, but those homes were counted in another project and then counted again here because a piece of land was added to the project through the Canada Lands Initiative. And so while that might be how you want to get to your 4,000 commitments, I think you just need to be clear. And that's why we made some recommendations even around if a project has been delayed or so on. That kind of information is useful. I think my biggest concern in this area is around how they're measuring success. And they're measuring success based on commitments, which is a great benchmark to get to, but those buildings are not ready for occupancy, and people who need affordable housing are going to be waiting longer than 27, 28 to be able to move in.
Thank you. I agree with you. I know the government has made very ambitious commitments to tackle housing affordability, including with the Federal Lands Initiative, and making those commitments and how you get there matters. And so I appreciate what you pointed out in this report. The CMHC, I think you mentioned this already, was also found to be reporting units committed and units that have been built in the same category, which we just discussed. You noted that after examining all 23 agreements, you found that they only provided for half of that, 49%, I think. You spoke to, not the 4,000. Could this be misleading to Canadians who are looking to evaluate the government's progress on the commitments that we just spoke about?
Well, I think your question aligns with exactly the statements I was making about providing better clarity. And we did conclude that they're well on track. I'm just trying to find the exhibit number that I could give you to point you to, but thank you. Exhibit 3 in the report sort of outlines our lay of the land. And the 49% is really those that will be available for occupancy by 27, 28, even though they're well on track to meeting the benchmark of having commitments for 4,000. And as everyone knows, when you do a renovation or a build, there are things that cause delays, and even that kind of clarity could be provided so that there is more accurate information for Canadians to make decisions on where maybe they could access affordable housing.
Thank you very much. Chair, how much time? A minute and a half. One final question. In your report, there were groups having difficulties navigating, quote, the CMHC legal framework. For Indigenous businesses, smaller and medium-sized businesses, what options do they have to participate in programs like these without having to hire lawyers, consultants, or lobbyists? How do they compete?
Well, I will see if Marguerite wants to add anything here, but I think what I would offer up is we spoke with Indigenous groups, and they actually appreciated their experience through the Canada Lands Initiative and are eager to participate again. But they did raise concerns with us about the burden that it puts on an Indigenous community to deal with all of the paperwork and the process and so on. And I think that's where I would expect the federal government, in the spirit of true reconciliation, to support Indigenous communities who want to participate in a different way than you would support another builder in the country. So I think it's about figuring out what they need and meeting them halfway and supporting them better. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add, Marguerite, but it's not necessary. It's up to you. Okay.
Could you comment on the experience of the smaller and medium-sized businesses who would want to compete in that space as well?
Yeah, I don't know if we zeroed in on smaller businesses versus larger businesses, but there's only 23 agreements, so there's not many participating. I think no matter what, you need rigor, but you can't make it too much, I think would be the advice I'd offer.
Thanks very much. Mr. Gasparo, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad you just mentioned that housing and infrastructure more broadly do take time to build and develop. On that point, you noted in the report on page 15 that the Federal Lands Initiative is on track to meet its goals. Are there any positive lessons the government should be taking as they go about setting up Build Canada homes?
I think setting out the right measure, right? You succeed because you stay focused on what you're going to measure, and measuring commitments is not the outcome needed. So they're well on track for the commitments. Wouldn't it have been so much more exciting to say well on track for having occupancy by those years? So I think the lesson I would say is, great job at setting a metric, but set one that focuses on outcomes as well as sort of the midpoint. A commitment's a great midpoint, but then the outcome is one I would hope that they would focus in on. Here, Public Service and Procurement Canada is trying to pilot accelerated ways of disposing of buildings, and I think that's a good lessons learned to see how that pilot's going. There was 10 buildings that were put in that to sort of shorten the period of time. Usually it takes about 8 years to free up a building and move it into the Canada Lands Initiative, and they're trying to do that in 3. I think building on some of their lessons learned throughout the pandemic, that doing things not sequentially, but doing them together could speed up the process. But it was too early for us to tell whether or not that will materialize. So I'd like to see them focus in on that, on better ways to free up buildings and get them into the Canada Lands Initiative.
And for sure, I think occupancy and infrastructure projects going COD are incredibly important. But you have to be going through the process at a timely clip in order to get to that final occupancy and ultimate result that we all want. In addition, do you have any overall thoughts on how the government should be going about streamlining the Federal Lands Initiative, and you touched on it a little bit, and public lands programs under the Build Canada Homes program?
I guess the overall thought I would give is that when you make a commitment, it sets out expectations, and then with expectation comes the need to be transparent in progress and how you plan on getting there. So that would be something I would encourage as the government moves through more home initiatives, is about being clear and transparent with where projects are at.
Great.
We will now go to Mr. Patzer for 5.
All right, so the cost overruns on the F-35. Right now it's at $27.7 billion total, so it's definitely over budget, 50% increases. The $7 billion Defence of Canada fighter infrastructure project, that's above and beyond that 27.7, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I think the 27.7 estimate, it's important to note that's the National Defence's estimate. We believe another $5.5 billion should be added to that for some essential weapons and facility upgrades.
And if D&D, which by extension means your audit, was based on incomplete or not fulsome information, how much more do you think the cost overrun actually is?
Well, at least 5.5 billion more than the 27.7. So we did try to sit back and say, what does make a CF-35 fully operational and capable? And that's why we picked up certain other elements. Other things that we couldn't cost yet because the government hadn't costed those would have been the interim facilities that are needed because of the 3-year delay in the 2 main bases. So they do need to have interim facilities, and that hadn't been costed out yet. So that would need to be added as well. And that's why we recommended a much more active and annual, minimum annual process and monitoring costs and updating estimates so that D&D knows what it needs to commit going forward.
Did you get a sense of what the actual final number of the amount of full-time employees would be required? I mean, again, I know the report says 246, but you said that was based on kind of a certain level of completeness of the program, but it wasn't based on the full completeness of the program. So if this program is, when it's fully rolled out, fully implemented, so I'm assuming that's Cold Lake, Bagotville, but also the other 8 bases that are listed in your report, in particularly Inuvik and Iqaluit, how many full-time employees are we going to need more than above and beyond that 246? Do you know?
Well, as we mentioned in the report, the 246 are about planning, logistics, and security. There's so much more that goes into running a base. And then you would have to add in pilots and technicians and maintenance crew. So I don't have that number. Neither does National Defense right now. They haven't finished all of their plans, which is why we could only talk to you about the level of detail that we have here. We do know that they are planning for pilot training, and their current plans don't envision to have enough pilots. So they need to do something different in order to ensure that they are ready when those aircraft arrive in Canada.
Yeah, the first group of pilots being trained is in the United States, correct?
Correct. The first few aircraft are going to the United States. They're expected to start in 2026 to be there to train Canada's pilots, and then the first plane is expected to arrive in Canada in 2028.
When the U.S. government, when the U.S. Government Accountability Office stated that the F-35 Block 4 upgrade is 5 years delayed and $6 billion over budget at least, was that factored into your report, or is that above and beyond as well?
I believe that the Government Accountability Office issued that very recently, and my report dates back to end of 24, and we released it in June of this year. So no, it would not have factored into information that was not yet available.
Okay. As far as other cost overruns, was there anything else that you flagged as potential? I mean, again, based on incomplete information, is there anything else you flagged as far as potential cost overruns?
I think our report outlined what we had identified. So the need to do temporary facilities, the need for more training, those are the minimum right now. As again, many of the plans were not complete, so it's difficult to be able to determine if they will come with additional costs. And that's why we've issued the recommendations we issued. But this is still very in the early stages, and I would expect that over the coming years that there will be a little more clarity provided to this, but more regular monitoring of costs in a proactive way is absolutely needed.
Thanks. Ms. Rochefort, please.
Just to finish on my line of questioning with respect to reduction of office space, you had indicated that there were 15 of the 37 tenants in the first tranche. There were 15 that had not yet signed agreements. I just want to verify who is responsible for signing agreements. Is there any political involvement in those agreements?
It's my understanding that an office reduction agreement is between the Deputy Minister of a department and Public Service and Procurement Canada. I can tell you that that's the agreement I've signed for my office, so I would imagine that everyone would have to follow a similar process.
Second question, just with respect to targets, occupational density targets. I'm assuming, are there any targets that are involved in these plans, in these agreements? And if so, from an OECD perspective, from a best practice perspective, are there typically occupational density targets that are set in such agreements?
Well, I think this is where every department has to make their own decision, right, about how much occupancy they need and how much space they need, and that's why the need to have accurate information about how existing space is being used is so essential in order to be able to move forward. I would imagine that my office would have less of a need, given we would expect auditors to be out occasionally on site auditing entities than someone who would have everyone in every single day because they're policy driven and so on. So I think it'll really depend department by department. There's so many different activities that the public service does that I don't think it would be a one size fits all.
Thank you.
Ms. Gaudreau, and then we'll finish with Ms. Jansen and then Mr. Souza. Go ahead, please.
Alors, Monsieur le Président, je vais...
Mr. Chair, given that I haven't much time, I will try to summarize what we have learned here today. 3 reports to address the F-35 acquisitions, the use of vacant federal office space, and then the GC strategies contracts. So let me go back over what I have understood from you, and if in the following seconds you have any recommendations to add, please go ahead. So first, as for contracts with GC strategies, not only is it a matter of accountability and not paying for proper services, but also security clearance. And I've understood that it's important to ensure that that is covered. I also understand that with regard to accountability, what's at issue is clarity, relevant data so that you can carry out your work. And you also mentioned that rules exist, but that we tend to let's put aside what happened in the past. Let's address the current situation. You mentioned exploring and streamlining rules to ensure that everything works and that everyone can respect the rules. You also mentioned risk assessment, which leads me to say that at this point in time, and not only when announcements are made, we must show exactly where we're headed with an action plan, rather than being able to say, oh, we hadn't seen this coming, so we are now reacting. That's more or less what I gathered from your presentation. Of course, we could go on and on about these topics for hours, but I would like to know whether there's anything else that we should be vigilant about or truly take to heart from what you've said. That's a very broad question. I could provide you with a list, but I think that if I focus on the 3 reports at issue here, better cost planning, better costing, that's often an issue that we pick up in our reports, that there was inefficient, inadequate costing, taking time to really lay out a project and cost it properly. Linked to your comment about good risk management, well, there's proper costing monitoring. When you have contracts in a foreign currency as well, of course, foreign exchange will shift, and this will have an effect on your budgeting. So you need much tighter surveillance and monitoring of cost, including foreign exchange factors. Allez-y, si vous voulez. Good. Let me help you out a little more here. Dynamic analysis. Situations change ongoing. A decision is taken, and, the tides roll in and out, and the world turns. So you need to ensure that your plan allows for flexibility and adjustment. Things will come up when you are monitoring things closely year in and year out. So it's really all about vigilance, about monitoring.
My pleasure. I never wish to cut off the AG. We'll go to Ms. Jansen, please.
I wanted to go back to affordable housing, if that's all right. And for me, it's clear that vulnerable families are who's being actually left out of the affordable housing projects. But according to your report, if I understand it correctly, the only thing we're counting are the Liberal promises as opposed to actual houses being built. Is that correct?
I guess how I would summarize it is that Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation is going in the right direction. They've got commitments, but they're falling short where it matters most, which would be affordability and move-in ready. But they're in the right direction. Securing commitments is the right step forward.
So I understood from the report that the Federal Lands Initiative doesn't actually report how many homes are built and ready. So it's only reporting things that have been promised or committed to. So Canadians have no clear way of knowing what they're really getting for their tax dollars. Would you agree?
Well, I think that's why we noted that their reporting lacked clarity, and we felt that it needed to include other elements, and we gave some examples that could be used. And a commitment is just that, in being move-in ready and understanding when construction has had delays is important, and that's why we think that more needs to be added to the public reporting.
So is there any transparent way for public to see how many of these units in these projects are actually being rented out at that so-called affordable rate? Is there a system in place to track that?
I believe the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation does some reporting. It was, if I'm not mistaken, a little behind. So we did put in some information in our report to give you a point-in-time estimate, and then made recommendations for CMHC to continue with that accurate reporting. So really, it's up to them to ask them what their plans are and when they plan on making that information public.
So there's no real way for a Canadian looking to see whether there's something available in an affordable housing unit. There's no way for them to find out where and how many, what's available.
I'm not sure I know where to send someone, but I would tell you that what you're looking for will also depend on the definition of affordability, and so what one individual thinks is affordable, another might not. So I imagine there are municipal resources and provincial resources. I don't think that the Canada Lands Initiative will provide all of the information that an individual will need in order to help find affordable housing in their community.
So taxpayers are footing the bill. So they deserve to know, are these dollars actually creating those affordable homes or just glossy announcements? So right now, is there a way for them to go somewhere to be able to see in their own town, in their own city, which ones of these units are there and available at the affordable rate?
If you're talking about the Canada Lands Initiative, they have public reporting, but as I said, that would not be the only place if I was in search of affordable housing that I would go look.
Okay, so I'm kind of concerned about even the broader risk, because without a good transparency in place, isn't there a real risk that at the same failures that we're seeing in the Federal Lands Initiative, that they're just going to be repeated, only at a much bigger, more expensive scale in the Build Canada Homes plan?
So I can't really comment on a project that I haven't audited, but clearly if the measure of affordability does not have some link to household income, I will raise the same concern that I have raised twice already. I do believe that affordability should be linked to household income, as the National Housing Strategy calls for and as Statistics Canada uses as a benchmark for affordability in our country.
One more question. So you mentioned you didn't want to put any more rules in place. What about the idea of a rule where we say you must be able to easily access information as to what is affordable housing available in your own town?
I mean, you're asking me to comment on a policy decision, and I think I'll leave that up to all of you to decide what's the best rules that the federal public service should follow.
Wonderful. Mr. Sousa, please.
Thank you again, and I guess we'll wrap up. 5 minutes? 4 minutes it is. So there's a line of questioning that kind of reinforces the need for the government to show its response to you in regards to the F-35s, in regards to what we're going to take next. So a lot of the questions I'm hearing is to government. So I think it's appropriate for us to get that review done so that we can reaffirm your recommendations, and I appreciate you putting that forward. My next item is a professional services contract. You made note of the fact that recommendations were made, rules exist. The government has taken the necessary precautions to ensure that those rules are noted. They just need to be followed. And they need to ensure that our service, our public service, ensures that they follow those rules to align with some of the recommendations made by you and others. I'm just recapping that part. Here's my question now. In regards to the modernization of the housing, your third report, and you attributed that there was resistance from federal tenants in the reallocation of funding. So I have a few questions in respect to this. Could anything have been done to prevent this, or what can be done to mitigate this in future in regards to the relationship with the tenants?
If I could comment on your comment, and then I'll actually get to your question. I think it isn't just about following the rules. I do believe that public servants need to understand why the rules are in place, and that might help with the application of them. And I think that's essential. But adding more rules is what's been happening right now, and I would encourage the government to take a step back and streamline in order to speed things up. When it comes to, now I have to remember the other question. Thank you. Tenants. Oh, yes, the tenants. Thank you. So I was so excited about rules.
Yeah. No, and I'm talking about now the delivery of some of the transparency in regards to
well, and I think this is why we highlighted in the report that not every government department has a financial incentive. If you had a financial incentive to reduce your rent, you'd most likely try to reduce your footprint if it's underutilized. And so it is up to the government to figure out the best way to get tenants to agree, whether that's consolidating into buildings, whether that's renovating some of the buildings so they're more attractive for people to come into work, whatever incentive they want. But I would personally encourage my deputy minister colleagues to think about how each of us can support the government's goal of reducing federal office space to help contribute to affordable housing.
Agreed. And the government has agreed with some of those recommendations. So I don't know, we can't predict the future, we can't predict future problems, but how would you handle those situations that aren't being addressed, like where they are resisting to provide the information?
I think Public Service and Procurement Canada needs to enforce the compliance. This is a stated government objective to reduce office space by 50% by 2034. And it's up to PSPC to entice and enforce that compliance, right?
Which brings us to the last question, sort of to recap this. Let's focus on some of the methodology that exists in some of the other OECD countries. And I think my colleague mentioned this about Australia and how they calculate the percentage of tenancies meeting the occupational density, the square meters, a lot of per employee targets. What is the right target? What do you feel should be established by the Government of Canada?
I think that's a difficult question. As I answered before, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. The space that you need in a laboratory will be different than the space you need in an office building. So I think it is about leveraging the expertise the public service has and understanding how their space is used now, and then looking to best practices in other countries, which is why in our report as well we highlighted Australia. We highlighted the kind of information that they put out there about office space that I believe would incentivize departments to want to reduce their office space if the federal government had that kind of information in the public domain.
And the incentive, of course, is there to provide greater operational efficiencies. But as you say, if not one size fits all, the respective average, I think, is what they're using. Like, how are they determining the differences in those spaces?
I'm not exactly sure how they're going about it, but I would tell you the motivation should be that a building, whether it is fully occupied or partially occupied, comes with costs. You need to maintain buildings, you need to operate buildings, and in many of the municipalities, the federal government has to make payments in lieu of taxes because the government doesn't pay municipal taxes. All of that comes with a cost, and that's why we highlighted the need there is some cost savings. The government estimated it at $3.9 billion over 10 years. That could be repurposed.
That's a great point, and that's part of what we need to do as we go forward. Thank you so much for all of you for being here today and your reports.
That's it, Chair. You took my line, Charles. That's why we brought you back today. Before you all pack up and go, I just have I have a couple quick questions, if you don't mind, colleagues. Did you look at NCC at all as part of this study, whether about their office space? And have you looked if the government is still purchasing office space at the same time they're trying to reduce their footprint?
So I can't tell you for sure whether the NCC was in here. We looked at, we wouldn't have targeted them. We are doing, I believe, a special examination on the National Capital Commission right now. But that won't look specifically at office space. Are they acquiring more office space? I don't think over the term of our audit that happened.
Like PSBC together, are they still adding office space?
I actually do not have an answer for that. We didn't look at that. We were focusing in on.
It's fair to say,
plan
though,
to
they
reduce.
shouldn't be when the government plan is to go the other way.
That might, I'm answering because of, the water. The short answer to that question is might be more complex. If certain buildings might not be sustainable for whatever reasons, maybe the repairs are going to cost more. It might make sense to acquire a different building. Not every building is going to be fit for purpose for a particular organization. So I would say that.
I would assume, though, that they would just, if the government's trying to get rid of 50% of the buildings, they would move over to government building rather than buy new buildings. So
For sure, when those buildings will be fit for purpose, but it won't be a one size fits all.
Right. The F-35, of course, the review date, published date, has come and gone. There's been some talk about a dual Air Force, well, two different planes. Have you looked at or considered what the added cost would be? And if the government moved away from the F-35 has been bandied about, considering how much has been invested, and the investments in Beggaville and Cold Lake are still going ahead to accommodate the F-35. Just curious if you can give a just quick idea about some of the costs that might be involved if that happened.
I mean, it's difficult to determine the cost should a change in direction happen when we don't even know if a change in direction has happened. I guess what I would offer up is that
Is the uncertainty about the review affecting things?
Well,
Again, because
right
the
now
review date has
there's-
come and gone, but we're still going ahead with investing in some of these buildings.
Well, I would say no matter what aircraft the Canadian Armed Forces chooses, they will need trained pilots and they will need upgraded facilities to house those. The technology of a new aircraft is different from the CF-18s.
Point of order,
So
Chair.
no matter what, that training will be needed and that investment will be needed.
Sure.
Just to clarify, there was no review date stated. The review was complete, but there was
That's
no
not a point of order, Mr. Souza.
But just to
thank
correct the
you
record,
for.
just to correct-
Well, it was my
It's in the
understanding.
media
Thank you
today
for
already that
identifying
the report
And
date
last
was missed.
question, it comes out to the GC strategy one. We had an order paper question come back that there's been expanded amount of files referred to the RCMP. I think it was up to 11 now. In a previous public accounts meeting I was at, PSBC said they weren't actually forcing repayment of some of these accounts. They were just negotiating with some of the companies that had been found to be improperly charging or defrauding the government. Do you think, and it may be not the role for you to opine on this, but do you think that kind of tells people the government's not serious about enforcing their own rules if we're not even forcing repayment?
I
Even
think
from
this,
companies that were referring to the RCMP?
So I really can't comment on files that have been referred to the RCMP, but in the case of the elements you're talking about where PSPC is trying to recover amounts, I believe it's not linked to GC strategies. It was linked to a
It
bigger,
is.
broader investigation around a vendor charging multiple departments for what appeared to be the same 7 hours in a day or the same piece of
The
work.
question is, and it's widespread, but the question is, do you think the government should be forcing immediate payment and not doing a negotiation
Well, I think
for
that once-
clearly identified?
Once a decision, once an investigation is done and it's clear that payment was made and services were not rendered, I would expect that overpayments will always be recovered. How the government goes about to get that is a decision they make. But I would expect you shouldn't pay for things you didn't receive.
Okay. Thank you. Now we'll get to Mr. Sousa's comment of thanking all of you. It's wonderful to see all of you. We're going to suspend it very briefly so everyone can say goodbye. Mr. Gahir, please stay on the same Zoom call because we will be back in about 2 minutes. We are suspended. Going forward. We're going to keep flexible because we're going to work around the schedules for the two ministers, which are always, as we mentioned before, a bit more difficult to work around. If we get all in agreement on the subcommittee report? Wonderful.
Can I clarify something? I know, I'm not on the
Yeah.
committee, but
No.
I know Ms. Judge is not here, and she was part of it. The Canada Lands is really not part of the PSPC, so I'm not sure if you want housing as a result, because housing is the one that's overseeing. On item 4, it's not a major issue. Yeah.
Canada Lands does come to OGO. We haven't had them in about 8 years. So it's not a definite, it's just one of the ones to, it's just one of the ones to consider. Probably not where the priority is public service, integrity, and, procurement ombudsman. But it's not a not necessary type thing, if that makes sense. Let's see.
I wasn't there, but item 1 with regards to the Consul Generals and new official resident, was that discussed? Was that something that?
Yes, it was in subcommittee. This is the subcommittee.
The subcommittee, I know,
that
and I think Marie-Helene was in the subcommittee. I would say I wasn't there, but was that, I wasn't sure what, because I've been getting reference from Ms. Judge that possibly it wasn't something that she had understood. But anyway.
No, it was to move forward to the report, and she was there. Did you wish, Madame?
Oui, ben moi, ce que je comprends, Monsieur le
Well, what I
Président,
understand, if I may, Chair, is that we have to begin. We have begun this morning, and we are now really settling into our agenda, the future menu of work. So it's always based on who's available. So we've allowed for some flexibility here, some elbow room, to ensure that we do have a menu set out here, a good menu. That said, when we have dates for which we can bring people in, and we're sure of that, I'm thinking of the 2 meetings because this is about a report, and all prior reports in the last legislature, the last parliament, rather, we have to at least finish them, at very least, without necessarily reopening them. So, Mr. Chair, it's quite clear to me that as to the draft of our future work, this is what we have that we recommend.
For a move forward. Let's see, just what else? Adopted budget. Time to time, colleagues. Sorry, Madame.
ben, le temps file, mais c'est parce que
Time is of the essence, but I want to give notice of a motion. I can read it in both official languages. I'll read it, and then I'll transfer it to you shortly afterwards.
Go through my stuff first, then Ms. Block had her hand up for motion, then we'll get to yours. From time to time, we get ATIP requests that do come through for ATIP committee business. We had a request from D&D. I'm going to bore everyone and read out something because it's the first time this has come up in about a year. D&D identified our committee as a third party in regards to records that are subject to requests made under the Act, sent October 15th. We receive requests from time to time, and OGO is no exception. They're straightforward, and we have a well-established process for them. Since this is the first time most of you are encountering such a procedure, I'm going to give you a more detailed explanation of the context, and I'm just going to read it verbatim from our clerk. ATIP Act gives public right to access records held by various government institutions, subject to certain exemptions. Even the House of Commons, including standing committees, is constitutionally and legally independent from the federal government and is not subject to the Act. We do receive third-party notices from government institutions when the requested materials contain information relating to the business of this specific committee. December 2013, House of Commons adopted the 42nd report of PROC regarding parliamentary privilege and access to information. The report establishes the process to be followed by committees when they receive third-party notices under the Act. The records at issue here are basically a nothing burger, consist of email exchanges between the clerk and the department inviting the minister and other officials to appear during a RIPCAN application. So it wasn't on any other information, it was solely the clerk sending an email out inviting someone. So it is up to us whether we wish to release it. I'm going to suggest we do, because there's nothing there except the clerk inviting a minister to attend. But we do need committee's approval to release that information.
Do you need a motion to that effect,
No,
or
if
just?
you see, it's fine. No,
I
fine?
agree.
Perfect. Oh.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai beaucoup de respect.
Mr. Chair, I have a good deal of respect for our interpreter. I think that I've been working for 2 hours, and even my own brain is sort of slowing down. But I want to ensure that when it comes to ATIP, I mean access to information, let's just make sure I understand this correctly, because I've been on the subcommittee on procedure. So we got an email to have a witness come in. Just go over that again, could you?
Defense. Part of the coverage is regarding ArriveCAN. So they are ATIPing it. So we're just asking whether it's okay to release that information as it covers OGO. In this case, it's solely the email inviting someone to committee. If it was something more sensitive, chances are we would say no. But in this case, it's solely the email inviting. So rather than say no and raise flags, I suggest that we just release the email. Perfect. I will remember to speak slower for the interpretation. Last item, I believe, is Mr. Gill is what we consider an associate member. I'm just seeking the committee's approval to include him on the email distribution list and access to our digital binder going forward, and if he can attend in-camera sessions. Yeah. I now have, I had Mrs. Block, and then I'll go to you for yours. Mrs. Block, go ahead. Oh.
Just, Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure that any of our associate members will also get a similar courtesy, if that's okay.
If you're bringing someone on as, it's kind of unusual if it's like a regular permanent associate member, like, sake of argument, Mr. Souza is going to be with us each and every time, but not an official member that needs to be subbed in, then yes. But not to every parliamentarian.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
Yep, makes sense.
Not that we wouldn't dearly love to have Mr. Sousa back. We're fine? No, it's wonderful having you back, Mr. Sousa. I tease you.
Did you want to set the party some?
Mrs. Block and then Ms. Gaudreau.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm actually going to retract my request.
Essentiellement, c'est parce qu'on.
Basically, there's a contract that will soon come to term for our interpreters, you see. So it would be important to take notice of this. We've not reached the point, I'm not prescribing anything here, but I will read this slowly, and I will send it to you as well in both languages. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083C, the committee, our committee then, Government Operations and Estimates, undertake to hold a meeting in the near future that would last for 2 hours in order to examine the renewal of interpreters as contracts, parliamentary interpreters as contract, and ensure that the quality, professional quality of interpretation services will be ongoing. And with due respect for parliamentarians to express their opinions and to work in either of the two official languages, that the committee invite, as soon as possible, the Minister of Government Transformation, Public Works and as well as the president or chair of AIC, the International Association of Conference Interpreters. I will send this to you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. For future?
En fait, je veux déposer l'avis de motion.
I want to table the notice of motion, but given that we have an agenda covering the weeks to come and that it's a full agenda, we simply need to propose a date. And I think that the date would have to be before the end of 2025.
For the record. Or are you just giving notice?
Yeah. Ben
Which
non,
is it?
en fait, je
Giving
veux pas la
notice
débattre.
or
C'est une mise en avis.
It's a notice of motion. Please remind me. So if I table it, we would have to debate it, correct? Or now?
the record to put it on later discussion?
Je veux qu'on en discute plus tard.
Very well. I would like us to discuss it later, keeping my eye on the clock here.
Wonderful. And perhaps, I understand it's 2 hours, perhaps when we have, if we can finalize when we have the PSPC minister, we'll see, rather than have them appear twice in a short period, perhaps they can extend a tiny bit and we can wrap it up at the same. But we'll follow up when we confirm the minister. If there's nothing else, I will thank Charles for being with us again, and we are adjourned.